And that's why Israel, in these verses at the beginning of the story, just as he's about to die, repeats the instruction that he made his son Joseph swear back in chapter 47, that he wouldn't bury him in Egypt, but bury him in the promised land, the land of Canaan. You see, at the end of his life, Israel trusts God's promise that one day, some point after his death, the Lord will fulfill that promise that he's made to his family. And he doesn't want his tomb to be in what will then become a foreign country, Egypt. He wants his tomb, he wants his burial place to be in the promised land, among where his people he knows and trusts will one day be. Perhaps as a reminder to them of the fulfillment of the promise that God had made to him and his family. Perhaps so that his tomb, his burial place, could be a reminder to the generations of his family to come of the grace and the mercy that God had shown to him. The thing about this story is, though, that Jacob's wish at the beginning of this story does set up what has the potential to be a real diplomatic incident. Now, every government has rules about what happens at death and burials, and the UK is no different. I wasn't very familiar with this. I was looking it up this week, but you can look up what you have to do when someone dies on gov.uk. And before you can bury someone or have a cremation, you must have registered the death with the authorities, and you must have been given authority from the government to go ahead with a burial or cremation. And I guess it's fairly obvious why you need that. But nonetheless, you do need government's permission to do this. And so Jacob, or Israel's request not to be buried in Egypt, but to be buried in the promised land, would have been very exceptional at that time. It would have broken Pharaoh's burial bureaucracy, as it were. It would have been doing something totally outside what normally happens in Egypt. But more than that also, it would have had the potential to cause great offence to Pharaoh and the whole of the Egyptian nation. They were the superpower nation at the time, a bit like the USA or the China of the time. We can imagine that with this request, someone would ask whether Israel thought that Egypt wasn't good enough for him to be buried in. We can imagine the train of thought that this kind of request might have set in train. Now, interestingly, in this story as well, we can see that Joseph, Israel's son, and the rest of his brothers do follow some of the burial customs of the Egyptians at this time. Every society has these rituals and customs around death, don't they? And our culture, or the culture that we're part of, or our multicultural society, is no different to that, is it? There's all conventions about how bodies are transported, the way that coffins look, what you kind of dress in at a funeral. There's all these conventions. And for Egypt at the time, I expect most of us have been to know about the mummies, that was the way that they dealt with their dead. Maybe you've even been with David on a tour of the British Museum to see those. We see in these verses, don't we, that Joseph follows that Egyptian custom of the way of dealing with a dead body. And so remarkably, Israel, his father, is embalmed in exactly the same way as an Egyptian would be. Certainly an Egyptian of high wealth and status would have been treated in those days. We can see as well that Joseph is following not just more of the customs, isn't he? So he follows the embalming. It seems like the Egyptians had this custom of 40 days there in verse 3, and he follows that as well. And he also follows the mourning conventions of Egypt. So we see that the Egyptians mourn for him for 70 days. Seems that was their custom at the time.